Okay, Jessica, how you doing? Let's go ahead and take a look here. So thank you very much for including your image credits. That's fantastic. And there's your articles. Thank you very much for including those. Decided to cut back on several elements, such as some of the color and images. However, I think I caught too many. Feels a little bland. I wish I could have added or kept some of the elements, although I will say it was a great practice in understanding InDesign typography layout. Okay, the first thing I want to mention is that you please feel free to keep anything that you feel works in the assignment. Remember, anything in the assignment, anything that you include in the layout should have direct and specific relevance to the article itself. So I think some of the graphics that you had included before, and my recommendation was based on the fact that I just didn't see a real clear connection between the graphic itself and the subject matter of the article. So one of the situations you don't want to be in as a designer is placing a graphic element in a position to take up space. And it seemed like, and I don't mean to sound discouraging, that's not why I'm making these comments. It seemed like some of the placement of in your sketches of some of those additional graphics were based on trying to fill up some area. So those were the basis of my recommendations. Now, if you can put graphics in that are directly relevant and serve a purpose, by all means, please feel free to do whatever you think is going to work in this situation. So I don't want you to think that I'm saying, hey, Jessica, you can't do that, and have you coming out of this assignment thinking, boy, I wish I could have done that. If you want to do it, do it. We'll address it. We'll talk about it. Does it work? Does it not work? And here are the reasons why. But at this juncture, I think it's really important for you to understand I'm not trying to take over your assignment, your project. I'm not trying to direct you into doing this, or this. I'm merely saying that these could be the results if you leave it this way, or this could potentially be the results if you were to change this, and here's the reasoning why. Okay, so that said, let's go ahead and jump over to the work, which I have up. Where is it? There it is right there. Okay, I'm going to zoom out here a little bit so we can fit this in the screen. Now, the first thing I see when we look at this is this an inviting article? And again, the most important thing for me at this point whoops. Sorry about that. The most important thing at this point, Jessica, is that these comments make sense to you and that you understand I am not trying to be discouraging. Okay, when I look at this article, I see, do I want to jump in here and read it? And the answer, I think, is no. And the reason being is because it's all text. There's just too much text here. It doesn't look like, excuse me, consider it like this. Okay, you stand on the edge of a swimming pool. It's an Olympic-sized swimming pool. So let's say it's 100 yards from this edge to that edge, and you have to swim. Now, if you look at that and you say, okay, I got to swim from here to there, boy, that's a long way. You would look at it differently if you were to say, if there were like 3 or 4 resting spots between here and the destination, right? Okay, so you're going to say, wow, this should be easy. All I have to do is swim from here to here. I can rest here a little bit, and then I can swim a little further, rest here. Same thing can be said with typographic layout. You're not giving the viewer any place to stop and rest. Okay, you're not really giving your viewer any direction saying, hey, I'm important, look at me. And I think that to a very high degree is what you're seeing here when you're saying this is looking, it could use more, where you say you basically you think you took too much away. All right, let's go ahead and jump in. Let's go ahead and take a look at typography. I think the typography is done pretty well. I'm going to zoom in here a little bit. And let's go ahead and, so yeah, your typography is set pretty well. This right here is a perfect spot to add a little bit of contrast right there. So maybe an italic type there. Remember, hierarchy is all about contrasts and creating contrasts. So that's an area that seems like could use a little bit of contrast. I think your rags, your typeface, your kerning, your leading, your spacing, your line lengths, your character count, your rags, everything is looking really good. This first page looks great. I don't see any typographic issues at all. Let's go ahead and move to the second page. In the second page, we do have a couple of typographic issues, and that's specifically when we come down to the bottom of the page. That is called a widow. You don't want that. That's another widow, and that is a word that sits on a line by itself, typically at the end of a paragraph. An orphan would be this, see this, if this were one line right here, if the period were right here, so an orphan would be a line of text that sits alone, typically the last sentence of a paragraph, And a widow is a word that sits alone. Again, typically the last word of a paragraph. The orphan is the last sentence of a paragraph as it comes to the next column of type. So you want to definitely pick those, fix those. A couple of things that we can do to fix, to add more visual engagement here. Whoops, let me zoom out, not in. Okay, so I think that the headline area, I think, could be handled more effectively if it were set up as an actual headline instead of depending on these images. I mean, you're basically, what you're doing here is you're using 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 images to say the same thing. YouTube. Why don't we just use one YouTube logo? And incorporate it in the headline somewhere instead of using. I think this is all basically. I think it's wasted space. We all know what YouTube is. We all know that there was a logo change. I think this area could be used more expeditiously. And for that reason, I say let's take this headline and assemble it up here. Don't be afraid to use scale. Increase the size of that headline. Do whatever you want. Be creative to introduce the article to your viewer. So let's get a nice typographic composition, big, for the headline up there. And then that's your headline. I know this is another typographic widow. Technically, that's a line of type that's included on a word that's included on a line by itself. So think about your typographic composition for the headline. All right, then add your byline, and then think of a deckhead. A deckhead is an introductory paragraph. So you've got your 2-column grid, right, or your 4-column grid, basically. Each column of text is taking 2 columns in the grid for a total of 2 columns of type, total of 4 grid columns, right? So that is adapted beautifully. Good job there. But I would add a deckhead, and a deckhead is a paragraph of information, kind of introducing the article. It's set at a larger scale than the typeface for the body copy, and it's a great way to introduce the article. Let me give you an example. This is a great deckhead right here. So here's the headline, right? And then here's the deckhead. And note that it breaks the grid. This is a 3-column grid. This one spans. You can feel free to do the same thing. Create a deckhead that you don't have to span both columns. You don't have to. You can make it shorter, but it should cross the gutter or the alley, just to point to this as a higher position and hierarchy than the body copy. Okay, so headline, deckhead. Start out with a drop cap. This is a drop cap right here. These are drop caps, really super interesting. That's a different, more dramatic variation of a drop cap. Here's a drop cap right here. Okay, here's a deckhead right here. Headline, deckhead. Okay, then I think another thing that's really, really looking for here is an image, another image or two. Try to add an image. Use a caption with the image and make sure the image has to do with the subject matter of the article. Images are a great way to kind of break things up. Viewers love images, and so I think that you could probably use an image on the right-hand side of the composition. Don't forget the caption in the image too is usually set in an italic typeface and usually set with contrast in, I'm sorry, with hierarchy in mind. Here's another deckhead right here. I think, yeah, that's a really interesting deckhead right there, drop cap. And all of these things, all you have to do is just go out and get on the internet and Google, how to create a deckhead in InDesign or how to set drop caps in InDesign. And then the next recommendation is called either a pull quote or a call out. And they're both set up quite similarly. And here's an example right here. We've all seen it, right? So you've got this kind of quote that spans the columns. It's made bigger. It's kind of a nice little break in the type. Provides a nice little respite to the densely packed type. Typically set in a way that defines contrast. This one is showing differences in weight and scale. So this is a great, and note the quote marks too. So again, just Google how to create pull quote or a call out. The difference between a pull quote and a call out is typically a pull quote is a quote from somewhere in the article. Ergo, the quote marks. A call out is simply just something. It could be a summary of something that's covered in the article. It doesn't have to be a direct quote. It doesn't even have to be verbatim, text verbatim. It just can be a summary of something that's covered in the article. So think about adding those to the composition. I think those will add a lot of visual interest. Page numbers, okay, don't forget your page numbers. And at the bottom of if this article doesn't end right here, you can add a continued on page, maybe in parentheses, set in an oblique. And then also watch your baseline grid right here. Right now, you've got, let me grab my straight edge, which I'm going to use to measure your baseline grid. So looks like you're in good alignment there on your baseline, but let's bring this across. Looks like columns, we did not want to do that. Columns 1, 2, and 4 are aligning baseline, but column 3 is not. So you definitely want to get that moved down there. If you have extra space left over, it would be more expeditious to leave that extra space at the end of the article as opposed to in the middle of the article. Okay, all right, so those are my recommendations, and I'd like to see you apply as many of these as possible. I think oh, and also subheads too. So if any of these, and let me show you some subheads. This is a subhead right here. This is a subhead right here. And then this article has several subheads as well. There's a subhead, there's a subhead, there's a subhead. So a lot of these things that I have just mentioned create contrasts, and contrasts create interest by providing variety to something that would be considered an otherwise pretty basic layout. The idea is not only to have an interest in the composition and the typographic layout, but also to be able to draw the viewer in, so the viewer looks at the article and doesn't say, oh, wow, that's going to be a lot to read. Do you see what I'm saying? That's why we use all this white space, drop caps, pull quotes, call outs, etc., etc. So think about that, and of course, do as much visual research as you possibly can. All right, those are my recommendations. I'd love to see you make some changes. If you have any questions at all, please let me know. I'll be glad to provide any necessary clarifications. All right, thank you very much.